Ooh.
Welcome everyone. We do get multiple requests for people to view this video or listen to the audio after the event. So that's why I have hit record so that we can share that. If that is not okay with anyone and you want to make sure that you are not included in the recording, please just send me a chat and I will remove you from anything that we put up. And then I am going to, I hope, if it's okay with all of you, I'd love to go around and have everyone quickly introduce themselves, since there are some names on here that I am not familiar with. And I can start that by saying I am Claire Strader and I am the organic vegetable educator for Dane County Extension and also the Fair Share CSA Coalition. And I am very pleased to be working with all of you on this exciting project. Rue, would you go next?
Sure, I'm Rue Ginger. I'm a researcher in the Department of Horticulture, and I'm part of the research team working on this, this project for reduced tillage and cover crop use.
And then if you'll pick someone else, maybe.
Oh, Dylan, do you want to go next?
Sure, yeah, my name's Dylan Bruce. I am a research assistant on this, or one of the researchers on this project. I guess I don't know the right term, but I also have a small market garden business on my family's farm that I try and use reduced tillage techniques on, so learn a lot from this group.
And then Dylan's on the phone, so I will pick, oh boy, you came on early and your name on the screen is Lotolski. Do you mind unmuting and introducing yourself for a moment? Thank you. Oh, you came on, but then you left.
Hi.
There you are.
Hi, my name is Laura Otulski, and I'm an aspiring farmer with an interest in reduced tillage and no-till methods. So
excellent.
Thank you for hosting this event.
Yeah, thanks for being here, Laura. And then Ronaldo, or at least Ronaldo's iPad. It might not be Ronaldo behind the iPad. I'm going to send you a little request to unmute and introduce yourself.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
it's this is Terry Precy. This was my husband's iPad. I guess I haven't upgraded it.
Okay.
But, sorry. I have a small farm in Dane County, and I was actually supposed to be in a study with Claire and Rue this fall or this summer, but we postponed it until next year. But I'm very interested in reduced tilling farming.
Great. And then we've got one person on the phone. The number is 608-609-6165. Would you be able to?
Yeah, this is Julie Dawson. Can you hear me?
Oh, hey.
Hi.
All these people I know hiding behind different names. All right, welcome, Julie. Thank you. And then Kat, yep. You are last. So if you want to introduce yourself and then just let me know when you want me to screen share your slides. I'm all set.
Okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Great. My disclaimer is I have bad rural everything. So I had to, I texted my pictures to Rue because I couldn't get anything to work from my farm. And now I'm parked at the end of the road. So if I disappear, I'll just rejoin. That's my disclaimer. And so I don't have very complicated slides. They're pictures, and we'll get to those in a little bit. But my name is Kat Becker. I'm located in north central Wisconsin in Athens. I'm about 45 minutes straight north of Marshfield, or about 40 minutes northwest of Wausau. And we are farm in a kind of zone 3, zone 4 border. My farm is about 6 acres total under tillage, I should say, or broken land with big headlands, and that includes hoop houses, caterpillar tunnels. We have 3 hoop houses. We have 12 100 by 14 caterpillar tunnels, which my spouse, and who has his own farm, brought with him to my farm. And almost everything is being produced on about 4.5 acres. And so we're really committed to cover cropping as a baseline practice. I have a cute cover crop picture in my pictures. But reduced tillage is something that, especially given the last 2 years, but also some of the larger rains this year, I think is something that I've been drawn to, and something that I think in the past has been kind of horrifying to me, the idea of taking out tillage, because I used to have extremely bad weed pressure at my old farm. And so one of the nice things, although I still have lots of weeds, is that I got to start over in certain ways. And so I had a lot of full knowledge about cover cropping when I did till my land. And I didn't just tarp. Another couple things about my farm that are relevant. One of them is that we have extremely heavy soils with poor drainage. We have a Magnor silt loam, which people in Madison would call clay. And we have a lot of rocks, and we farm in raised beds because our water table through the end of May, or depending on how late spring goes, is only 6 inches below the ground. And so there's not a lot of space for the water to move. And so we have very, very wet springs and early summers. And then also, even in land that is in perennial pasture, there is not very good infiltration in large rain events. And so it makes certain parts of reducing or getting rid of tillage more complicated, or at least complicated intellectually for me. So the two things I'm going to talk about, and I'm happy to I'm not an expert. That's what I just want to put out there. I'm like exploring these options and looking at different ways that we can reduce tillage really in the short term, and then also in longer term systems. But the two main things I'm going to talk about today are our setup for a 3-year no/reduced till trial. And that's going to be a bunch of pictures of my squash fields that have a lot of landscape fabric. And so I'll talk about those. And then the other thing that I'm going to talk about is how we're trying to move our caterpillar tunnels, kind of not very successfully, but eventually successfully, into a semi-permanent raised bed system. So because I've been exploring my own farm since I moved there in 2017, these caterpillar tunnels, since they've arrived, have moved every year, which is totally insane. And so what we're trying to do is situate them in a single location in a long-term strategy, which I can talk about, and have basically a covered semi-permanent raised bed system where we can raise the beds a little bit more if needed, or in my ideal world, the drainage will get so good magically that we will be able to just let the beds kind of fall naturally, and those areas would basically be no-till beds with walkways in between. So that is the background. I of course, I'm going to open up my own pictures in my text message, like a really super professional. Can you hear me okay still?
Yep, we can hear you. And you want me to start that screen share now?
Sure. That would be great.
All right, there we go. People can see your first slide.
Is
Actually,
my first slide, is it buckwheat?
It says your name and what you're going to talk about. Now it is squash. Let me see.
Okay. Can I see it? Well, let me see if I can see it in your pic. Hold on. I'm of course like super bad at this somehow. Oh, good. Okay, I can see it. Great. Something, because of our scale, I should say the other thing I didn't mention is that we're minorly land constrained under, I guess, given that I'm not willing to till in my headlands and that we have bad drainage. So they're kind of constraints that I've put on my farm that maybe aren't real, but I don't want to see all my soil run in like gullies. And we don't have like any slope, I should say. We have very little slope in our farm, but we have big headlands that I'm not really willing to compromise. But within that, we're kind of constrained by drainage. So while my land on my farm technically has 17 acres that USDA considers tillable, I think it's more like 8. And then we have big headlands around the smaller fields that usually range from like 1/2 an acre to 3/4. I guess we have one that's almost an acre. And so cover cropping is something that we're very committed to. Part of the reason that I'm farming as many acres as I'm farming is mainly because I have a certain amount of debt I have to service for the first 5 years of my farming operation. So that is one of the constraints that will change over time, and I think allow me to move to a system, which I think is probably the ideal system, where there's about 50% of the land in cover crop, full season cover crop a year, but that's just not where I'm at. And so a lot of what we're trying to do right now is squeeze cover crops in whenever and wherever we can, which means that I use a ton of buckwheat. Just because buckwheat is super fast, it can actually go between crops, and it winter kills. And so buckwheat is kind of, while there are a lot of cover crops that I like for other reasons, buckwheat is something that I've used a lot more of than I have historically ever else on my farm. I kind of used to be an oats and peas lady. And we are doing some rye, although I have not ventured into the crimping or rolling of anything. That kind of scares me because of the amount of moisture in our soil. So that's my background. There's our beautifully seeded by my neighbor buckwheat cover crop in some of our best drained soil. I can go to my next shot. I don't know which one's next, but
Oh,
okay.
there you
There,
go.
no, that's good. Okay, so you can see that is my squash field. That is a picture I took today. The system that we have put in place, the idea behind the system for reduced tillage on a big chunk of land, is to kind of create a rotation where we thought we could most easily reduce or eliminate tillage, at least a 3 or 4 year rotation, and then try to implement that on a piece of land, with the idea that we might fail on part of it, but we were really committed to having at least 4 or 5 beds, and our beds are about 200 to 225 feet long, at least 4 beds that would stay in that. Although I think we're just keeping this whole area in reduced/no tillage for next year. So what we did is we used a raised bed maker, kind of a regular rain flow, but without plastic, and made raised beds. We have 2 different widths of beds we can make, but this is like the same size bed that you would make if you were laying 4-foot plastic. So we made those beds kind of one next to each other. The land that it was going into was actually in an oats and peas cover crop. So we did chisel plow and disc, and then make raised beds and amend the soil all at the same time. And then we went through and laid landscape fabric. And so we did actually 2 different systems of laying landscape fabric, which I think is almost the most interesting thing that's happening. But the idea is that we'll have squash this year under landscape fabric. We'll be able to pull it out and remove the few weeds that there are by hand. Even if we leave the vegetative matter there over winter, we'll be able to pull back landscape fabric in the spring if we decide to, and we kind of haven't made a decision about if we're going to pull all of that vegetation out or just let it die back and pull stuff in the spring. And then when we pull it out in the spring, what we'll have is basically fairly clean beds. And I'll talk about the areas that they aren't that clean. And we'll be able to experiment with a few different types of alliums in those beds. So we are going to be using 2 of those beds this fall for garlic, and we'll basically be pulling them up, re-amending the soil. Depending on how much we can get our fingers in the soil, we may surface till with a BCS or broad fork those beds, and then lay landscape fabric back down and plant garlic. And then the other beds will be used for onions and leeks for next season. And we do have a few extra beds, and so we may be experimenting with some things like dry or regular snap beans that are supposed to be in that field as well. So the idea is that we would basically pull that back. We'll plant onions. We plant our onions, which I should have given you a picture, but I didn't, into both open beds and landscape fabric. So we'll be relaying landscape fabric both on the beds and in some of the aisles. And then in the other aisles between the beds, we'll be seeding in probably some annual rye and clover that we can mow with a push mower or a weed whacker. We don't have a fancy flail mower, and quite honestly, I'm super afraid of everything because of our rock situation. So it needs to be something that we can't destroy too much. And then we will be growing our alliums in them, and the following season we'll pull out our alliums. Onions come out around this time of year. We'll be able to get a cover crop probably right into those beds that second year on top of the beds, which will likely be buckwheat, but we may try one in rye. And then we'll be going into solanaceous crops specifically peppers the following year, just because it's an easy solanaceous crop to deal with. So that's kind of the system that we're trialing, and then we may just indefinitely put it into our rotation if it seems to be working. With the setup, I don't know if Claire, if you can go to the next picture. It's very similar. The one thing I want to note in these pictures is you can see like it's pretty clean. I mean, we do have some big weeds running down the aisles. I'll show you pictures in a minute, but the way we did landscape fabric, we have some landscape fabric that we have used in the past. So we reuse it, and then we usually rotate the crops and disinfect it between crops. But we laid landscape fabric that has holes, which I'll show you. But the alternate approach that we used, which is something that I don't know if actually Claire might have even told me about this, somebody, or it might have been Julie, everyone on the phone, that someone was laying their landscape up to the edge of their tomatoes rather than putting holes in it. So we started doing that because that's really nice and makes it easier to reuse landscape fabric between different crops. And so then some of those beds basically have two beds next to each other. The ones in front of you have holes down the middle, and then there's a piece of landscape fabric between in the aisle. But then there are other beds where we're running the landscape fabric between the beds with a slit in the middle of the bed, if that makes sense. So the middle of the bed is open. It's like between 3 to 6 inches wide. And you can see where those 3 to 6 inch wide slits are. That's where the tall weeds are. So while we did go down and hand weed a little bit, we didn't do a very good job. And so the weeds came up right in that aisle. And then the squash plants got big and we didn't want to kill them. So that's the main weed pressure. Otherwise, there's almost no weed pressure in the beds that have the holes in between. Although we planted, I don't know when all of you also planted your cucurbits this year, but it was extremely hot and we had laid row cover even though we had drip irrigation. And the plants that were in the beds that had the open slits rather than the holes burned definitely had a lot less transplant shock and didn't really have the sunburn and heat stress that the ones that were in the holes did. And I don't know if that's because of the radiating heat off the landscape fabric, but that's a kind of a side note to why we ended up liking that slit approach.
Can you say that one more time, Kat? I want to make sure I understood that.
Yep. Oh,
so you're planting into the slit because that's like you don't have to burn holes and it makes it easier, but then you're seeing this other benefit. Can you talk about that one more time?
Yeah, basically the plants we put into the slit looked a lot healthier when we went and looked at them the next week. I mean, there was a lot of heat stress that week. It was very, very hot. And then it also happens to be a horrible cucumber beetle year. So we already were making sure that they were covered. In another year, I might have even pulled off the row cover, but we didn't really want to create that situation. So we did have some plant loss and had to go in and retransplant into some of the beds where there were holes burned. Versus the ones with the slits. I don't know if it's because just the soil was cooler or the plant stems were more comfortable against the soil. But that direct soil contact, which for a lot of crops, like solanaceous crops, is not ideal, really seemed to shelter them from heat. So we really liked that system.
Thank you.
So, yeah. So you can go to the next slide. Just going to try to give you guys pictures of this. So you can see the two different systems. This is today. So the one on with my feet is the slit system, and then the other one is the hole system. So it's really not that much exposed soil. It does take a lot more time. So Logan, who is like a landscape fabric master, and I told him I would, next time he lays landscape fabric in the spring, I will take a video of it because it's extremely like tight and perfect and fast, which also is kind of how he works. So that's like, it's hard to tell. I don't think I can do as good of a job, but he's kind of trained me to lay landscape fabric very tight. We never have it blow up. That's never an issue for us. And it stays in place really nicely. But it was a lot more work for him and then me subsequently to lay it in the strips because it doesn't line up perfectly. And part of that is because we don't make beds perfectly, but it was a lot more work you'd lay a piece and then you were trying to make it line up on two different sides, if that makes sense. That's 6-foot landscape. And so it's like more work intellectually than laying a roll down the middle with holes in it and then putting something down the aisle. Although it uses less landscape fabric to do it this way, less pins, and both systems seem to work. But that's what it looks like. Yeah.
Kat, can I ask you a follow-up question on that?
Yeah.
So you've talked about the labor difference in actually laying the landscape fabric. Can you talk, is there any labor difference in transplanting into the slit versus the hole?
I much prefer, I don't know how many of you have planted into landscape fabric, but it hurts your hands. I mean, I don't plant with gloves on. I know that there are people that do that, but even with like nitrile gloves, I think it still hurts, and I like to be able to feel plants when I'm planting. I found planting into the slits much easier. It was much faster. Although the other thing I should mention is we've gone to all 6-inch drip. We used to have foot drip. And I don't know why. That was just like what I was taught to do. And then I just did it for 15 years, like blindly. But I went to a presentation last year in New Hampshire at a veggie conference where they were talking about laying multiple lines of drip to get more access to the nutrients that were in like hoop houses. But they were also talking about how 6-inch drip gives much more even coverage, which it does. But so we planted into 6-inch drip, which is also nice if you're going to plant anything 18 inches apart. So if you are, or even 2 feet, if you have different spacing, but it's really nice for plant spacing. If you turn it on, depending on what your pressure is and all of that, but if you turn it on and you don't soak the beds beforehand, it's really easy to see where the holes are or which need to be for spacing. And that system also made it go very fast. Otherwise you are kind of like trying to coddle the plant and not hurt it getting into the holes. We have fairly small holes, I should say that also, in our landscape fabric. Okay, so there's the squash field. I'm just trying to give you all an idea of the weed. You can just see the weeds, right, running down the aisles. And if you look on the far right side where it transitions into a brassica area, there was 2 places where we had our melons where we were very worried about cucumber beetles. We did not put down landscape fabric because the other downfall of this system is that it is impossible to use those row cover stakes in the landscape fabric and have them not pull out. So we're very able to keep row cover down using those pegs normally, and because our soil is so heavy and wet. But with the landscape fabric, we had really bad like pulling out. So we ended up using some of our many rocks to peg it down on landscape fabric. So if you are gonna do a system like this and use row cover simultaneously, you should use sandbags, or I guess there's some people that lay down rebar, but something that is not one of those stakes. So we ended up pulling that out of that side, and you can see the weed pressure from those aisles, even though we wheel hoed them. You know how squash is, right? So then, you know, the tiny lamb's quarters get gigantic. So that is another thing to note in terms of the weed control in the system. And our main goal for this system is to have a pretty clean bed. And this is this area was all in a cover crop last year. And be able to transition it easily into a system where we can try some live aisles and then also kind of a replicated system for onions. But the idea is to kind of just not disturb it very much and keep it covered with some of these plastic type covers as we transition to some of the live mulch or open bed systems for solanaceous crops or other things in the future. So that's a picture. I don't know what's next. These are all very not super exciting. Okay, does anyone have any questions about like what our goals are or what we're going for before I talk about caterpillar tunnels?
Feel free, everybody's on mute, I think. So do please unmute yourself and feel free to ask a question. I do not have access to the chat box screen sharing. So if you're writing anything in the chat, I can't see it.
Neither can I. So someone's gonna have to read it to me.
Rue, I think got kicked off with her bad internet, but I think is back on now, I hope. And then
Yes.
Okay, great.
I am back on, but I had to call in with my phone, so I can't actually see this either.
We're chat free today. Okay, chat box free.
Everyone's in charge of their own comments, and feel free to interrupt me. I love interruption.
Yeah, I'm not seeing anything, Kat. Everyone is just on mute.
Okay, well, here's my other system. So this is all like, I seem like I'm like a landscape fabric salesperson, but I do want to say that like landscape fabric on our farm has kind of a different role than I saw it in the future or in the past. One of the main things I wanted to do on my farm and my recreation of my farm career was to really get rid of or try to not use very much black agricultural plastic. And we are using it on solanaceous crops because they're just a disease nightmare. And we are using them, there was actually a picture in the beginning, on overwintered August planted strawberries, because I'm just like replicating someone else's system before I start innovating anything with it. But we really try to not have a lot of that, although landscape fabric, right, while it is reusable, is also plastic. And I totally understand that. And the roles that it is playing, I talked about kind of creating this weed-free or undisturbed area. I do like it because water does go through it. So there's much less irrigation, while it does keep the soil more moist, significantly more moist from drying out. It also keeps the soil generally, in a lot of cases, cooler. I know there was a lettuce presentation at the Veggie Growers Conference a few years ago where someone was showing the temperatures taken under landscape fabric. So in hot weather, it can actually be cooler. I think a lot of that is also moisture, but plastic is very hot. But it's also there because we're just trying to farm with not enough labor. This COVID year, we made a decision to invest in more landscape fabric rather than an extra employee, because we were so afraid of like that dynamic in the spring. And it's way cheaper than an extra employee, by the way. But so it's in some of these systems where there, you could mow, you could manage live mulches. Those are things I'd like to do. And again, I'm likely farming what I think on an ecological level is slightly too much land for a better system, but that's what's actually going on. So this is our very messy tomato hoop house. Julie Dawson's on here. This is the outside row. The middle has the SARE trial in it that I do with Julie. But this year we tried putting some landscape fabric between a couple of tunnels. So this tunnel is actually staying in place. The tomato tunnels are staying in place for next season. We kind of replicated the same thing in this tunnel for next year. And so we're trying to get the weeds both between the tunnel so we can put down clover that we can actually mow and not have, like, our farm is very wet. So sedges naturally come up between things. So instead of having a ton of sedges, we'd like to have mowable clover. And then also just not a lot of grass weeds like foxtail, which actually concerns me. And then we also, I don't know if you want to go to the next slide. Oh, do you want to try one more? I don't actually know what order I sent these in. There might be like, it might be, okay. You want to go back? Okay, that's fine. It's cool. I probably just didn't send a picture, which is classic. So if you go to that, back to the tomato one, the landscape fabric is exactly the same as in the squash, like butted up against itself. And we did use the metal, those metal, what the heck are they called? They're like stakes that look like a U, to hold it together rather than burn holes in it to make it reusable. But the idea is that we'll be able to pull out the tomatoes. We used all wooden stakes this year in an attempt to not have an early blight nightmare transfer. And then we'll be able to not reform the beds, not touch them, and then just broad fork or surface till and plant into them. The next picture I have is two different ways that we've managed I'll kind of show you like reduced tillage versus tillage. If you look at the caterpillar tunnel on the left, which has baby carrots in it right now and drip irrigation.
So, can I ask a quick question, Kat?
Yes, go for it.
What do you follow your tomatoes with, typically?
So it depends on where so the field and the caterpillar tunnels are like totally different systems, because in the caterpillar tunnel setting, tomatoes are actually very unique in my caterpillar tunnel setting. But in the caterpillar tunnel setting, a lot of my caterpillar tunnels get 3 crops a year, but the tomato tunnel only gets 1. So the tomato tunnels aren't rotating like as maybe like the other tunnels might. But that tunnel, I should have maps in front of me. I'm of course down the road. Give me 1 second to think about what's going in there next year. I'm fairly sure that we're going into beans next year, followed by fall brassicas. So we do an early planting of beans. I mean, by early, I mean like late or mid-early May. It's kind of our assurance policy for having beans early. And then we go into a brassica crop. So things that are fairly easy to weed. Outside are, again, my rotation, because I've been on my farm not that long, is not as steady as it probably should be. But outside my solanaceous crops for next year, I'm just thinking about where everything is. I just need my mental map. I should pull it up on my phone. I have an actual map on my phone. But our solanaceous crops next year are going into fall brassicas. So they're going into a rye cover crop. And then they're going to be fall brassicas next year. So that's my two systems. And our outside solanaceous crops are in like black plastic, and like that land will probably get incorporated in because we need to plant a cover crop. Is that helpful?
Yeah, thank you.
Good. So this caterpillar tunnel picture has, the one on the left has been tilled. The aisles were tilled, and then we re-scooped up all the dirt from the aisles into the middle. The tunnel on the right has been there for, so we didn't move, I should say we didn't move all of our tunnels, we moved half of them for the last year, we moved all of them. This year we moved half of them. So this one has been there for, this is its second year that it's been in place, and we've BCS the middle, and you can see we just turned on drip, and then I had to go turn it off because I didn't know that it was on that tunnel. But you can see the aisles are kind of weedy, so we've been hoeing those aisles a little bit. And in one of our tunnels, we laid folded over landscape fabric in them, but we've basically not been touching the aisles. So these are very flat beds, but very nice beds. And so that tunnel on the right was in beets, and it's going into lettuce. But we are tilling with the BCS, so it's not like there's no tillage, but we aren't hitting the aisles at all. And it's a single pass on the top. So I don't know how many of you have used a BCS rototiller, but often for bed prep, people go kind of there and back on a bed. And for these beds, we've been doing a very like shallow till on the top. And that one was also broad forked in the spring. And the broad forking is like totally insane and labor intensive, but does seem to make a really big difference for water infiltration, sometimes even in a negative way. But it does seem to really help with the soil tilth without really turning it over. So that's kind of the comparison for the caterpillar tunnels. And the system we're going to for caterpillar tunnels, in some of it we're going to implement next year, also has us using either silage, tarp, or landscape fabric to try to kill and then plant directly into beds. I have to say, like, I know a lot of people are doing this for prep initially in the spring, and I've seen some farmers, especially in the South, laying landscape fabric, pulling it up and then planting right into beds. It's not very hot here. And so the turnaround time between crops in at least the caterpillar tunnels is usually fairly fast. And so I'm not fully convinced that I can get it, kind of get stuff incorporated in. That said, I'm going to try it on my spring lettuce next year because that should die. But at this time of year, when we have fairly cool days and fairly cool nights, it is harder for me to imagine that laying something for 2 weeks would get me a plantable surface, although that's totally not based on fact or experimentation. So we're going to try it next year, but we have still been tilling, at least in a surface way on those. So I have to say that is all that I have. I'm happy to answer questions. I'm in the initial phases of doing this work. So I'm by no means an expert. And then the other thing I did want to mention is that we are doing this year for no-till, and that it goes back to buckwheat, is we are pre-making beds to move some of our caterpillar tunnels for a more permanent system. We are moving to 200-foot caterpillar tunnels, which is like mildly nuts, instead of 2 100s. So we're basically turning them into one. It's actually slightly bigger than 200, obviously, but that's just, we are making beds this week and then planting buckwheat into them, which will winter kill. So we're trying to incorporate a cover into some of those spaces from the get-go. And that's been a thing that's been challenging, is trying to figure out how to manage cover crops, especially those that aren't winter killed on raised beds. Okay, I'm done talking now.
That was really great, Kat. Thank you. I hope.
Thanks. I hope it was good.
Yeah, I know I wasn't. Oh, and there's Rue taking notes. When I was screen sharing, I wasn't able to take notes. So I'm glad to see Rue has carefully documented. So I do want to open it up for people. That was, Kat's a fast talker, as we all know. So if anybody wants.
I know, I'm so fast. You can't stop.
You know I love that cat, but I might be in the minority there. I'm not sure. So I do want to make sure everyone has a chance to ask questions, and we can backtrack and look at any of those photos. Also, those will be easy to bring back up if anybody wants to see those. So opening it up for questions for Kat. And I should say not limited to questions, but if you have any ideas sparked based on what she said and want to have discussion around any of that, that's all fair game.
Or recommendations for me to try, I'll take that too.
Hi, Kat. Hi, Kat. This is Laura. Thanks so much. I'm curious if you're planning on incorporating mulch into your system at all, or is it just too cold and wet where you are?
So I have, that's a great question. So so like my background on my farm, like I had a different farm, very close, same zone, same soil, everything, right down the road. And we used a lot of mulch. We had our own grain. And so we had our own mulch, and we also bought in mulch, straw mulch. We also had a ton of foxtail. And so I have like a foxtail phobia. And a lot of the weeds that come in on mulch, I guess, scare me a lot. We have talked about, and I know this group has talked about, kind of producing mulches in place. So I would like know the mulch was clean, and I'd be cutting it myself onto land next to the land that I'm farming. That's a system where I'm super interested in, like having mulch, especially between beds instead of landscape fabric. But at this point, I haven't found a source of mulch that I'm confident is either not laced with pesticide or filled with weeds. And I have to say my weed phobia has, like, I still have weeds, but like my idea of seeding my farm in grasses scares me. So I've been avoiding mulches. However, I've used them I've used them on potatoes. I've used them on in between solanaceous beds. I used to blow mulch in between my plastic beds for squash and peppers and tomatoes. And it does work really well. Like there's like no question about that. I did have problems with mulch like sprouting because of how wet our farm is. But I'm not anti-mulch. I just haven't been incorporating mulch into our farm. And I do have some far-flung ideas about, those kind of mulch strips that I'm controlling. But I haven't gotten there yet. But I think mulch is great, even when it's cold.
Great.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Any other questions for Kat?
So many questions, but I'll hold back. But one big one that I have been struggling with lately, because I broke our mulching mower, is the question of mowing. And you mentioned earlier, and I apologize if you covered it, I was doing deliveries at the same
No,
time,
you're fine.
but like maybe string weeder or push mower for
Yeah.
managing clover on beds. And I have like found at times when living aisles get away from me and there's too much debris flying into crops that it causes a lot of disease.
Yes.
And wondering like, are those beds or those living aisles far away from your other crops? And like, what would be your tool of choice for people who also have rocks and don't want an expensive flail mower?
Yeah, so we do have a BCS, what the heck is it called? Rotary mower. That's it's like a brush hog, but tiny. I don't know the name of tools. This is perfect. So
I think it's right, Kat.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have a tiny brush hog that goes that goes in front of the BCS actually. And I hate that tool. Logan is better with the BCS than I am, like better at managing hitting things. But you definitely hit rocks, or we hit rocks with it. And it's also not narrow enough to go between our beds. That's another like downfall of my farming system, is that we put our beds very close together because we're looking at like yield per acre. And so it seems really irrational to space out beds. Whereas like at my old farm, something we did do was mow between beds, but we put the beds further apart. And I know Tenzin Botsford at Red Door Family Farm has been experimenting with that. They have a flail mower. I don't know how he doesn't destroy it, since, we have more rocks, but they also have rocks, but that scares me. The string weeder is kind of our go-to, I have to say, but you do have to do it when everything is small. And ready for this craziness, Dylan? This is like Cat Becker special of the year, is that I took a piece of like polycarbonate this year when we were string weeding next to our cucurbit caterpillar tunnels, so like zucchini, because I was terrified of just this same issue, like, you know, having little pieces hit them, opening them up, having them get disease. And so that actually worked fairly well. It's not like the most efficient thing ever, but for a smaller area, like if you can have someone hold a shield for you, the nice thing about a caterpillar tunnel is that you can like lean it up against the tunnel. But that actually worked. It seemed mildly insane at the time, but it worked. And those were big weeds that I needed to deal with, some bigger perennial weeds. But I don't have a perfect mower, and I wish that I had something better, because that's something that really keeps me from doing living aisles, because of the rocks and the fact that we have wet aisles and the fact that they're close together. So I would love ideas of, you know, you need something that's kind of like one of those mini tillers, but a mower version.
And Kat, I think I missed what it is that you hate about the brush hog on the BCS. Is it flinging too much material, or does it just not fit?
It doesn't fit well, but even where it does fit, like, because it's spinning, when you hit a rock, it's very jolting in like a bone hurting way.
Got it.
So I don't love that.
Okay. Thank you. Kat, I also want to open it up if you have any questions for the group. Is there anything this group can help you problem solve?
I mean, the mowing thing, Dylan, if you figure that out, I'd love to know some ideas around that. I mean, yeah, I guess the like transition, the idea of like taking away all of your like weeds, but then also like vegetative cover as a first step for no-till seems like kind of problematic and counterintuitive, but that is like what I'm doing. So I would love ideas on alternative approaches. And then also, if anyone has ideas of managing and I know that this was talked about a little bit like before, but managing non-winter killed cover crops, so overwintered cover crops on raised beds, because like that is another thing, aside from using like landscape fabric or silage tarp. That's another like big hurdle for my system, because I don't believe that we can actually farm on flat land here, especially in the spring. In the fall we could, but in the spring I think it's going to be rough.
They do make, Kat, I think this is not a reasonable idea potentially for your system given the cost, but when I was in North Carolina, they do now make a roller crimper that works on raised beds. And you should, if you have any trouble Googling that at all, I have some photos that I can send you from when I was there. And I think it's just the University of North Carolina, one of the research stations.
Cool.
Near Ashland. I think that was still.
Look that up.
Yeah, I mean, it's not a cheap piece of equipment, and they're definitely using a tractor to pull it.
Yeah.
So there's, you know, compaction issues and stuff there, but obviously the tires are riding in the trenches and the gullies, and then it's just set up so it rolls flat across the top, and then there's like these two wing rollers that travel along the slopes.
That is a good, and a BCS version of that would be great.
Yeah. Has anyone on this call looked at or tried we are trying it. So Dylan is the one who can answer this question, like the power crimper that'll work behind a BCS. But the one I'm talking about is definitely not BCS ready. It's those regular herringbone rollers. Dylan, do you want to talk at all about your BCS power crimper experience?
So that walk behind crimper, which I'm not sure if it would be quite called a power crimper, because maybe to me that maybe says PTO powered, but I think it could work on a raised bed if you had like the wide the spacers for wheels to straddle the bed. It definitely could. But
don't buy those spacers. They're not fun. We bought them and I hate them. I'm just telling everyone that.
I believe it. I wouldn't try. I think it could work. It would just contribute to the collapse of the bed. And you'd have to do something different on the side of the beds. My experience winter rye also is that, you know, if you keep it mowed, it'll die if you're doing a fall crop. But other than that, it's not quick enough.
Yeah.
Claire, was the research station you went to the mountain one near Ashland that Janine Davis runs?
We went to that one, but that was not where the crimper was.
Okay.
You know what? Ashland, that, it was
Asheville, I
close.
think.
It was closer to the shore. And if somebody said
Okay.
the name, I would remember the town, but it's not coming to my head. Yeah.
Because Janine Davis was the one doing the landscape fabric that I saw, who had done all of her organic tomatoes and cucurbits with the landscape fabric. So she might be someone to get in touch with if she would also probably know where the roller crimper was if they wanted to do like a Zoom call or something. I know she's been thinking about alternatives.
You do know
for this group.
I can't remember his name off the top of my head. I'd have to look it up. But the man who was our host when we were there, he's a Chinese man, and he does a lot of vegetables and work with vegetables in hoop houses. And he's also doing some hemp trials, and he definitely knows you. So it was like wherever
he's at NCA&T, I think, not North Carolina State, but
okay. I
think
think
he's at NCA&T. He's down farther close to the coast. Yeah, and he's doing the organic tomatoes. So I'd be happy to get in touch with both of them if you wanted to maybe do some kind of like this call, but with them.
Oh, that's a great idea.
If that would be of interest, I can shoot them an email.
I'd love to hear what the farmers have to say on this. I think that about that, because I think that would be fascinating.
We could maybe get some farmers from down their way too.
Yeah, exactly.
That sounds great.
Okay, I'll do that and just see like if they're available and what the interest would be.
Great.
So no-till on raised beds and landscape fabric tricks.
Great.
All right.
So Kat, that was our somewhat postponing of the solution there.
No, that's great.
That's a great cliffhanger to get people coming back to calls.
Yeah. Well, I've gotten a bunch of, well, as I said at the beginning, I've gotten messages from people who want to watch this later. I think, you know, even 5 o'clock on a sunny Monday in August is not the most popular time.
No.
Yeah. As we get deeper into the winter, it'll get easier for people. Any other questions or discussion points? And I'm opening it up really wide right now. So, and Rue, I'd love for you to jump in. I just see you came off mute. It could also be like Julie was talking about other topics that we would want to do in the future on this type of call.
I just wanted to remind people to take lots of photos, because when the winter comes and you want to talk about what the awesome things you've done on your farm, it'll be great if you have photos to show.
Yeah. Excellent reminder.
Kat, could you reiterate, you had said at the beginning, and I'm sure this is something I missed, but that your reduced tillage cropping system is a 3-year cycle?
I have committed to it for 3 years, but my actual rotation on my farm is more like a 6. So
right.
I've committed to 3 crops in a row, mentally
and
committed.
You're starting with winter squash. What are the next 2?
So it's winter squash into alliums, so it'll include both garlic in the fall and then onions and possibly leeks in the spring, or shallots, you know, that kind of stuff. And then we'll see, like the edge of that field might get something else. We might try something else in one of those beds because we have more squash beds than we do allium beds. And then after that is solanaceous crops, but specifically like for the 4 beds that I'm fully committed to, if it's like in case the rest of the system starts imploding. For now, those are, at least some of those are peppers. But you know, my solanaceous crops outside other than potatoes rotate together. So, and I'm not growing eggplant anymore. So, you know, tomatillos are on the table, I guess. And so are tomatoes.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
it's totally a low-hanging fruit system. Like, I tried to make the easiest system. I'm just putting that out there for everyone. Like, as you can notice, there's like no direct seeded things in there. And like, you know, I tried to make something that was pretty easy as like to get my confidence up.
Well, you've also talked about rotational tillage, Kat. So that's like, if you can do 3 years and then you have to till, so be it.
Yeah.
You've got 3 years.
Yeah, and that is like, I'm assuming we are going to have a component of tillage in the system, especially if we are going to eventually have half the land in cover crops, moving that from cover crops into raised beds. I mean, it seems like there will be tillage, but yes, that's exactly what I'm planning on, trying to get tillage out of parts of the farm for multiple years in a row, for a lot of reasons. But I think that's a good goal for farmers that are into tillage now, is trying to remove it for several seasons.
All right. Dylan, I think you're the only one I've heard say you've got more questions. So if you want to bring anything else up, now is the time. Otherwise, we will conclude.
That's all right. We can conclude. I won't belabor the finer points.
All right. I am going to stop the recording.